Hi, folks. My name is Mark Hummel. This is Mark Hummel's Harmonica Party. And today I'm just outside of Chicago at Dick Sherman's home. And this is Dick Sherman, who is a producer and musicologist and has been involved in the blues in Chicago since what, 1970?
No, I actually came back here for the first time in '68,
Okay.
right after the convention riots.
Aha, okay. And now you got into music in Seattle, right?
Yeah, I grew up out in Seattle, and I always tell people my musical background is that on my father's side of the family, I'm directly descended from Felix Mendelssohn. My grandmother was a Mendelssohn, and on my mother's side of the family, both her parents were deaf. So,
So you got that good mix.
right. So I tell people that when they're listening to one of my productions, the whirring sound they hear in the background is Felix turning over in his grave. But my mother played some piano, and my father wasn't a musician, but he loved to listen to it. And when I was a kid, I heard some blues on the radio. The top 40 station there was a little bit open-minded, so I heard "Turn On Your Love Light" and "Part-Time Love" and "Boom Boom." And
So were you a teenager at that point?
yeah, on the cusp, adolescent. And then it turned out my parents' attorneys were where all the folk blues artists stayed coming through. And their son was a blues, I guess we'd call a blues freak. And he turned me on to Lightning Hopkins. And,
Now, what was his name?
Joe Breskin.
Huh,
He had two sisters who played guitar out in the Northwest for a long time, Flip and Kitty Breskin. And so between those things, and then the British invasion, like
Right.
a lot of people, who did this song first? What else did they do? They sound pretty cool. And then I had a friend, you might even know him, Steve Bailey.
Right,
in Seattle.
right, I know Steve
And he and I
Bailey,
got
yeah.
into blues together, and it was a great
okay.
situation because I had a tape recorder and he had a job, so we'd go looking for records, and he had the $3 it would take to buy a budget BB King album or whatever, and then he'd let me tape it. I'm gonna see him in a few days out in Seattle. He's still leading a band, but so I have pretty decent knowledge of what blues is, although I hadn't seen much of it live, and I didn't really have much sense of what the black blues scene was in Seattle, other than listening to the black radio station, which was the first place I heard Albert Collins, among other things.
Somebody you got to know and work with.
Right. But so I had some taste of blues, and then when it was time to apply for college, I applied to University of Chicago and got in, and was lucky that my first week back here, I fell into contact with some people who were from here and into the blues scene, and were great. And then the other link in this all was the weekend that would have been my senior prom. I went to see Junior Wells. He had Louis Myers in his band.
Wow.
And they were both really encouraging to me. There just weren't that many people like me yet. And
Right.
so they had me come hang the hotel most of the weekend. And I remember the bass player walked in where Louis and I were talking about Freddie King, and the bass player had this incredulous, like, he knows who Freddie King is?
Now, was this in Seattle, you're saying?
Yeah,
Okay.
like 60,
Oh,
68.
okay. So were they encouraging you to come to Chicago? Was
Well,
that-
I already knew I was coming,
Yeah.
so they said, "Well, look me up when you
okay.
get back here."
Right.
And Lewis was like, I don't know if I'd say second father, but he was a huge mentor and
Right.
always a friend to me.
Right.
And he lived not very far from campus, so when I wanted to get away from the madness that was Hyde Park and the university, I'd just go crash on his couch where he lived with his mother. And
That was 68?
yeah.
Yeah. So that was in the middle of the riots and the whole thing.
Well, right after, and I mean, it definitely had an effect. I knew a lot of fellow students who had been caught up in it one way or
Democratic
another.
convention.
The
Yeah.
vibe was still
Right.
pretty prevalent, and there was very uneasy relationship between the university and the Chicago Police Department.
Yeah.
But
Wildly.
it was a great gateway to the blues scene, as it was for Elvin Bishop and
Right.
Nick Gravenites and
Right.
a bunch of other people before and after me. Johnny Bergen, one of
Right.
the later ones.
Yeah. So what's interesting about you is you fell in with everybody, it seems like, and became really good friends.
I still can't believe how nice they were.
That's what I'm saying.
Not just to me, but it was so much nicer than they needed to be. Although, looking back on it later, I did a panel with Jim O'Neill at Blues Fest once, and he made a good point that I never really quite formulated in words, but it was what those guys wanted from us was to help them. Mm-hmm. They're mostly on their backs. They were scuffling like crazy, and nothing. It was kind of a lull for a lot of them before they'd been rediscovered, and after the burst of popularity had faded. I mean, Lewis was playing for a mob go-go dancer joint, and Bilo was working at a burlesque theater.
Wow.
There was just a lot.
And this is in the 60s.
Yeah, 68. Yeah. So, they. And also at that time, because there weren't many of us white people who were very knowledgeable, they thought if we could recite, who played on their record in 1953 for Chance Records or whatever, that it meant that we knew everything about them. Well, after a while, they came to figure out that was kind of a superficial type of knowledge, and it didn't really mean we knew anything about what they had to cope with on a daily basis, or the fact that hardly any of them could even keep a working phone, or much less own a house, or have decent wheels. But speaking of phones, one of the things I always loved was, virtually nobody was in the phone book because their phone number kept changing. But you could always look in the phone book and find McKinley Morganfield and Chester Burnett, and if you called, they would answer.
Right.
So,
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say that a lot of the blues guys around here that weren't, Muddy and Howlin' Wolf, and that most of these guys had day gigs half the time, or were
some
they
of them
just
had day
scuffling?
gigs, and actually some of them tried to keep it hid. It was kind of embarrassing to admit you had taken a job at the steel mill because you were desperate. And sometimes rumor would go around, oh, so-and-so saw so-and-so at the mill, and don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
But either day gigs or some kind of hustle, or, life was pretty tough. I mean, Magic Sam was hand to mouth. He couldn't live at home because his wife was getting ADC, child support.
Right.
So when the caseworkers stopped by, he had to hide in the closet.
Oh my God. Yeah. That's incredible. So, somebody like, I can think of so many guys you've told me you were close to. I mean, Howlin' Wolf in particular, it's amazing to me how good of friends it sounds like you guys were.
I waited a while. I got to know Lewis. I mean, I already knew Lewis a little in junior.
Right.
I approached Otis Rush early on because he was just a great hero of mine. And one of my Hyde Park friends, David Bloom, who now runs the Bloom School of Jazz, he's a guitar player. He used to play with Chicago Slim back in those days. Jerome Arnold was in the band with him for a while. But he had a 45 of Frosty by Albert Collins with Otis Rush and a number scribbled on it. And I was looking through his records. And, what is this? And I took a lesson from Otis. He loaned me these. So I just called him up and said I was a big fan and couldn't get enough of his music. And he had a social club gig coming up, so he invited me to come by his house and took me to the gig. And we became great friends after that. And ran into Johnny Shines at a local record store. We got to be great friends. Every Sunday morning for a month, he took me to Willie Dixon's house, and we'd sit in the basement. And I didn't want to miss a word. That was when I started drinking coffee, so I'd be sure I was awake and didn't miss anything they were saying. Earl Hooker, I got to know pretty quick.
That's amazing.
He was fabulous.
Yeah.
He was the one guy, but I would tape him in the clubs. He would want to go listen to it afterwards.
Wow.
And Magic Sam, he used to ask me if I wanted to make live tapes, but Bob Kester had asked me not to, so I respected that and refrained. But I booked Sam for one gig and then referred him for another gig that he played. And the day before Sam died, I was on the phone with a couple of friends of mine in Seattle who wanted to start a blues booking agency, lining up work for him. Sam had called me. He'd gotten back from what turned out to be a disastrous trip out to LA for the Ash Grove, where there was a financial misunderstanding. He thought they were going to provide the band. They thought he was going to provide the band. So they took money from him to pay the band that they had to hire. So he fired his manager, Denny Bruce. He told Denny to jump in the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
And could I help him? So we're on the phone lining up all these gigs on a Sunday afternoon. Shall I wait for that to...
Okay.
Oh, right. So this was on a Sunday afternoon. I was trying to find him some work, and the next morning, Billy Boy called me and told me Sam was dead.
Wow.
So, yeah, that was kind of earth-shaking.
Denny Bruce, was he the one that had Tacoma or something?
I don't know if he had Tacoma, but he was managing the T-Birds.
Right.
And
That's
others,
what
I'm sure.
Yeah,
I think he maybe was also involved with Steve Levere in the World Pacific Blues series. Oakland
another
Blues.
shady guy.
Yeah.
Steve Levere. So, and then Howlin' Wolf, you said...
I waited a little while because people told me that he disliked white people. But when I finally called him, he invited me over for dinner. His wife turned out to be a great cook, and his daughter, Barbara, was really nice. The older stepdaughter, Betty, wasn't living at home then, but Barbara was. She had dropped out of community college and was working at a title and trust company. You know, typical life of a blues man and his family, right? So she would always entertain me while Wolf was getting dressed and ready to go to the show and all that stuff. But what I found was more than anything else, including making music, I think Wolf's favorite thing in life was telling people how to live. He would do it to his band on the bandstand all the time. These boys think they know music, but they don't know life. And, you know, just all this kind of stuff like that. And he took me as a young man who could use fatherly guidance. And of course, I mean, I appreciate it. It wasn't like later I realized how lucky I was. I knew it every second when I was around him. So I used to go, you know, I'd take a cab from my dorm to his place, and they'd feed me, and he'd drive me out with my tape recorder, and I'd tape him all night, and he'd drive me back. It was a great thing. I mean, Wolf was a complicated person, you know, he could vary, you know, there were some times he wouldn't always be as warm at other times, but, you know, he never was mean or anything like that, and he was very hospitable. I remember once, we were sitting around his kitchen table when I was visiting before I moved here to stay, and I was staying with Billy Boy, and Wolf looked, "You staying with Jerome's brother, huh?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You could have stayed here." Well, if I'd known that.
Wow.
I'll be back in 15 minutes with my bags. But so he was great. You know, again, just think of how incredibly blessed I was. And also, I got here right at the end. I mean, if I just got here just in time to get to know Sam and Earl Hooker. I missed Little Walter by a little bit. I've always regretted it. I missed Elmore by a few years. I think I had my bar mitzvah the day he died.
Now, was that in 65 or something?
63.
63.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would have loved to have seen Babyface Leroy.
Right, well, he was dead in the 50s,
58, I think. Yeah, I mean, if I had a time machine, I'd put me and my tape recorder in it and find where Leroy and Muddy and Walter were working. Maybe Jimmy Rogers. Take my recorder, but unfortunately,
Well, you sure got to know a lot of those guys, man.
Well, they're just so accessible.
Yeah. And you produced a lot of people. I mean, you produced Otis Rush. You produced Albert Collins.
That started later. At first, I really wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to do something to help spread the word, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And so I started writing articles for Blues Unlimited, and I had a radio show in Seattle for 3.5 years. Some of them are on the internet. The website is Crab, KRAB-FM, and my show was called Urban Blues, and there's a bunch of them that are posted. And in retrospect, my knowledge was pitiful, but at least my taste was good when I listened back later. But I was just kind of doing various things, and then Bob Kester had a sign-up sheet for what was going to become Living Blues magazine up in his store, and I'd been on the yearbook and the literary magazine staff in high school. I could do this, so actually there was talk that I was going to be the original editor, but I moved back to Seattle to finish school, and I've thanked my lucky stars 1,000 times because the people who did get the magazine going did so much better than I would have done.
Is that Jim O'Neill in there?
Yeah, Jim and Bruce and Paul Guerin, a few others, Amy. But when I got back here, I had been around a couple sessions. Bob Kester let me come, and so I got some chances to see people work producing and be in the studio, and it seemed like I had an affinity for it. And then Wes Race referred me to Bob Kester to help him when Otis finally signed with him after years of futile pursuit, because I knew Otis well and I knew his repertoire well, and they just figured I'd be helpful for the project, which was Cold Day in Hell in 1975.
So that was your first production for Otis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Frank Scott, I had heard some acoustic recordings that Amy, I think, had taped of Homesick. And I had thought for a long time I wanted to tape Lewis doing some old school acoustic country blues stuff too. And Frank Scott, who you know from the Bay Area, was amenable to a compilation like that. So I did tape Lewis and his brother Bob in Lewis's apartment, and that came out in Chicago Blues at Home.
Right.
And then I met Steve Weisner, Ace Harmonica Sleuth.
Right.
And we became real good friends. And he had already done a little producing. He'd done a session with Lucky Lopez and a session with Big Red and Easy Baby. But he started involving me and inviting me to his sessions. And I helped a little bit with the Good Rockin' Charles, but I was mostly just a spectator soaking it all in and did the notes, but more instrumental in helping him with Eddie C. Campbell,
right,
King of the Jungle.
Right.
I was the guy that kind of urged him to
that was
do
what
something
label
with
was that on Double Trouble?
Mr. Blues.
Mr. Blues
was his
right.
label.
Yeah.
And then I helped him a little bit more with the Mojo Buford album. In fact, two guitar players played one of my guitars on that.
The Summit one? Is that
Yeah,
it?
Blue Summit.
Right.
Yeah. And then Bruce and I had been friends for quite a while. I actually met him in Seattle. He came through with Hound Dog Taylor to audition
You're talking Bruce
for
here.
a gig. Yeah. But so he started seeking my feedback on stuff. I'm still not quite sure why, but of course I was honored. And then I'd known Albert since my Seattle days. He literally used to play on the corner from where I lived there sometimes, and we got to be good friends. I had written a Living Blues article about him. Mm-hmm. And so we reconnected at the fateful 77 San Francisco Blues Festival, where you and Johnny Waters were sitting right in front of me.
That was my first review I ever got, was you writing about me.
But anyhow, so I reconnected with Albert there, and then I talked, circumstances evolved that I went to Europe with Albert for his first time over there that winter, and was able to persuade Bruce to sign him. And so I went from there with Alligator, and we ended up doing 6 Albert ones together, and there were 3 Johnny Winter ones. The third one was without Bruce, but I was involved in all 3. Bruce licensed albums I did with Johnny Hartzman and Fenton Robinson, and then we did Roy Buchanan's last 3 together. Mm-hmm. And then there's certain little different chapters. I won't give you too many more, but I connected through I had a news column in a bunch of blues magazines, and from that I connected with at first it was called Black Cat Records, and they changed to Double Trouble and Black Magic. The owners ended up splitting a few releases down the road. But they had me do 2 Andrew Brown albums, and Fenton and Lacey Gibson and Hip Link Chain's last session. That was a great relationship. I still love those guys to death.
Yeah.
Jerry Robson, Kees van Wijngaarden in Holland.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of Johnny and Albert, I ended up getting connected with Point Blank, an offshoot of Virgin Records,
right.
And did 4 Johnny Winter albums for them, and did the mixing and editing of Albert's live posthumous release, and did half of a Charlie Musselwhite album for them in '96. And then probably the last big chapter of my producing is that around 2008, maybe, Bob Kester finally signed Eddie C. Campbell, who we were real tight. I mean, Eddie always called me his brother. So when they signed Eddie, they figured I'd be the one to produce him. And that led to a great relationship with Delmark for a little over 10 years until the company was sold. And,
So how many albums did Eddie C. do?
Well, he just did 2 for Delmark.
Did you do one with Blind Pig as well? Was that
No,
you?
I was at that session, but
Yeah.
I didn't work on that project. It's a nice album though. That was his first one when he came back from Europe.
Yeah.
But Eddie, Lurie, Jimmy Burns. I'm going to forget somebody. The Rockwell Avenue Blues Band was Steve
with
Freud,
Steve,
Ted
yeah.
Robinson,
Right.
Ken Sadak,
Right.
Guy King,
So you produced all
Billy
of them.
Flynn.
Wow.
So I wasn't doing everybody on Delmark, but and then I helped Steve Wagner, their studio manager, with the Carrie Bell tribute. One of the things I felt good about that
Oh, right.
was that Charlie Musselwhite had worked for Delmark, but he never made it into the Delmark discography. So while he was passing through town with the Take Me to the River tour, we went over there and he played on one of the cuts on the Carrie tribute. So,
Oh, cool.
And then we stopped by and he had a nice reunion with Bob Kester at the
Yeah,
record store.
because they were tight.
Right.
Yeah, he and Carrie, I remember,
Yeah.
were pretty tight.
So those are the main chapters in my producing career. And then I've written about 150 sets of liner notes and
Wow.
been on the Blues Festival Committee for almost 40 years.
Right.
Just odds and ends.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, the thing that really struck me, I remember the last time I was at the Blues Festival, and I was going to do an interview with Billy Boy, and I asked you to
the
come
Sonny
on
Boy
board.
panel, yeah.
And yeah, it was the Sonny Boy Sonny Boy tribute year, and I remember having you on that was just such a godsend because you knew all these people.
Well,
That I was not even familiar with, and I consider myself fairly up on stuff.
Well,
but,
and I've known Billy for a long time. I just knew a few buttons to push.
Yeah,
I mean, you would have done fine without me, but I just, there were certain pet topics I knew.
but I'm just saying, you know, so many of these really underground blues players from Chicago that either didn't record much or if at all, and people that were just on the scene that very few people know about.
Yeah, well, I was into it.
Yeah,
I am
mean,
into it.
it's really amazing just how knowledgeable you are with.
But part of the whole blues thing was championing the underdog and
Right,
getting recognition for people who deserved it. So, I mean, I kind of saw the same thing happen to Alligator. Once somebody has some success and becomes the establishment, then blues fans don't like them as much.
True. I never thought
Johnny
about
Shines
that, but you're right.
Always used to say he
Yeah.
was going to call his autobiography "Success Was My Downfall," but that's kind of how it works. So we weren't interested in the guys that had 10 albums. We were interested in the people, Good Rockin' Charles, who missed the Jimmy Rogers session he was supposed to play on. Just the obscurity was part of the charm.
That's
and
probably
it kind of
true,
made
yeah.
it seem more authentic in some cases, and it was great to finally help some of them tell their stories.
Right. And I mean, Billy Flynn's like that too.
Totally.
And so is Steve Geiger. I mean, they're really into, the guys that just did like 2 sides on so-and-so's, recording session or something like that. Listen to that tone, listen to that phrasing.
Well, one of the many things I love about Billy, I mean, he's just a wonderful, wonderful musician. But I think he's an even better person. And I think one of the reasons he has such good rapport with the 5,000 people who want to hire him at any given moment is that his respect and love for the artists and what they do is just so obvious.
Yeah, it is. It really is. It's pretty amazing. Well, both of those guys, him and Steve Geiger, both to me are just they're really treasures in terms of just who they're championing all the time.
Yeah, way back even in the 70s, I remember Steve was in touch with Jim O'Neill. He was the go-to guy for what chess 45s have an alternate take on, that indie people missed. And, he was a great sleuth. I mean, he had the Excellos around that time. He played with a lot of the Chicago cats.
Right. No, that's awesome. Well, the other thing I wanted to get into with you is just, I mean, you've got so many stories. I love all the stories you have about, this guy and that guy doing, this, at this time. And I don't know how much of that we want to get into because it can get pretty nitty gritty. But is just your take on the blues scene from back then versus the blues scene now, because it's really, I mean, I know, most of us that have been into this music 40, 50 years have a much different feeling about what it was like back then compared to what it's like now.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like an old fuddy-duddy.
But you
of
will.
course, but I am.
Right.
I mean, on the one hand, there's still a lot of vitality, and there is a current scene. I mean, still 7 nights a week you can hear something here. I was at the Joliet Blues Festival yesterday, and summertime I've got so many friends coming through like you, and I've been going out 3 or 4 nights a week just to see people passing through.
Right.
But I mean, it's very, very different in so many ways. I mean, there are virtually no white blues clubs in Chicago when I started going around. It was before the Lincoln Avenue scene had started,
Right.
and after Big John's and Mother Blues were gone. So it was basically black people playing for black people in ghetto clubs. And I've heard people, I think the way Bruce puts it is, it used to be us telling us about us, now it's us telling them about us. And when I would see a lot of these artists start to play places like the Wise Fools, they were kind of off balance because, blues is very much interactive with the audience in what I'll call its traditional element. Lots of hollering back and forth, and it's a little bit like church. And,
Right.
Just like I say, lots of call and response and signifying going on and clapping on the correct beat. I've got tape of BB in Europe for the first time, and there's one German show, the whole audience is clapping on the 1 and 3. But anyhow, the way Bruce, I mean, he's got a point, and so these people would start playing these Northside places, and they weren't getting back what they were expecting to get back at strategic points, and they weren't sure what to do.
Yeah.
And they kindly figured it out. It didn't take too long usually. I'm talking about people like Magic Slim and Lonnie Brooks, and that what people wanted was just for them to forget they were on the North Side and just play like they played if they were on the South Side, except they were more likely to get paid and have a better PA and have less danger going back to their car after the gig, although that could be a problem for some of them on the North Side. But
when you say it could be a problem for them on the North Side in terms of white people?
Yeah, there's a few black artists that were uncomfortable going to the North Side clubs. They didn't feel welcome. There's going to be a few bad apples in every barrel.
Right.
But I mean, what I found on going to the clubs in the South Side, or the West Side, I always told people I felt safer there than I would have been going to hear country at some shit kicker honky tonk.
Right.
That's what there would have been happy to beat me up in the parking lot. But if you went to a ghetto blues club, the owner didn't want trouble with white people in his place. He was afraid he'd be closed down. The artist didn't want to be in a situation where the word was that people who liked him couldn't go see him because it wasn't safe, and they wanted the help that we could offer. And most of the blues audience was an old enough generation that, I mean, it's a sad truth, but to a lot of them, messing with a white person was death.
Yeah.
And they were there for the same reason we were, to have a good time and love some blues. I mean, it's a friendly thing. So I didn't really, I mean, I don't know anybody that was a fatality by going. I mean, Steve Cushing got shot, but he worked hard.
That was he kind of earned that one almost.
Yeah, and there was an occasional stick up or something like that. But I mean, I got stuck up once outside of Pepper's. It was very mellow and non-violent. I got my car broken into once at Teresa's. But I mean, living in any kind of city, that's probably less than the statistical average of petty crime that an average person encounters. But it's of course changed. I mean, there's so much attrition. There's virtually no place left standing. I mean, Teresa's, the building is still standing. And of all places on the west side, the Big Squeeze Club, which I saw Buddy Guy described in the Tribune today as a bucket of blood, is still standing on the worst block on the west side.
Wow.
After all these years, although of course there's no sign of activity. But, you know, virtually all the places where venues were are unmarked vacant lots or Walgreens or church or the wildest blues club I ever went to is the entranceway now to an FBI headquarters on the west side.
Wow.
You know, of the people who I knew well when I was first back here, I think Billy Boy is really the only one who's left. I mean, I knew Buddy, but we weren't as tight. So it's been almost complete turnover. And there's still a lot of great folks around the scene and a lot of good talent in Chicago. I mean, it's really changed. There's virtually no bands that have a regular harmonica chair. I mean, there's John Primer and, you know, Willie Buck mostly just goes by and sits in, but he wants to have a harp player with him, tail dragger until he passed away. But, you know, and that's really about it.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And pianos, I mean, it used to be every bar had a piano in it, you know.
Yeah.
Now there's still some good players around, but it's not a standard feature of a blues band anymore. I mean, it's more like it'll be two guitars and bass and drums.
So what do you think the how can I put it? What do you think the reason for that things going out of style like that? Is it just time? Is it just the influences of like soul music, or what do you think?
It's both of those things.
Yeah.
You know, it's just kind of inevitable. Everything's going to change. People are going to die. People are going to be born. People are going to want to define themselves. You know, there's always going to be turnover, and you know, we've got to be ready to let not just the blues but everything about this world around us change. That's just how it works. So I don't expect it to sound like it was when I could go up and down Roosevelt Road on a given night and find Albert King, Earl Hooker, Magic Sam, Otis Rush, Mighty Joe Young, Eddie Clearwater, or the South Side where Wolf would be playing Peppers or Otis Rush on a Wednesday night. There was always something, Teresa's or the Blue Flame, or you know, there's just a lot going on. I mean, Elvin used to say there are probably like 100 blues clubs average weekend. But it's just inevitable changes of attrition and changing tastes. And blues was always like that. It's always soaked up outside influences. I mean, all you gotta do is look at some of the stuff some of these guys recorded, the ragtimey hokum stuff that Robert Johnson recorded. And a lot of these guys didn't have blues in their repertoire. In fact, actually, I think one thing that skewed the perception on this a little bit is up until, I'd say maybe the 80s was when I really saw it starting to change. The people who were recording blues were pretty purist in their border drawing. And if you had a band like somebody like Eddie King, for example, who was a jukebox basically, or like Lonnie Brooks, Mighty Joe, they wouldn't record that part of their repertoire. You know, maybe they did a great version of Tyrone Davis medley or Gotta Find a Way or something like that, but they'd skip that stuff and, you know, get right straight to the 12-bar blues. So they weren't really doing as full of a representation of what these artists were doing. Later on, the labels started to see it more holistically, and like my friend Steve Weiser, when he recorded Eddie King, fine. You know, they did an Ann Peebles tune, and you know, they let them mix it up. And also, I mean, it used to be a lot of labels were blues and jazz or blues and gospel, and there's not so much of that. You know, that's separated too.
So in a way, you think that the producers were kind of almost trying to put them in, pigeonhole them into a blues thing.
I do, and I'm probably guilty of it, you know, as far as that goes for the time.
Right.
Of course, another thing that's changed, though, is just the different recording media. When at first I really felt liberated by working in the LP environment because, you know, 45's 3.5 minutes was about the limit, you know, for airplay and for what you could, you know, press up on on a disc. And so the songs were concise. You know, you had maybe a 4-bar intro, a couple vocal verses, a 1 chorus solo, sing another verse, and then out. Well, with an LP, you had what seemed like all the time in the world then, even though it was still only about half the length of a CD if you want it.
Right.
So you could let guys play more like they played the tunes live, you know, go around with an extra set of verses and lengthen the solo. And, you know, so that changed a lot too. I think the music became a little less focused and more oriented towards jamming and, you know, particularly for a white audience, you know, instrumental heroics.
So a lot of that would have been like the hippie thing kind of making its way into black
Yeah,
groups.
I think that that's certainly related. You know,
Yeah.
I think a lot of them thought, you know, the psychedelic scene that was part of that, all the jamming and
Right.
looseness going on.
Right. And you were into like me, you're kind of into the psychedelic thing.
Yeah,
Back
well, I
then.
grew up in
Yeah,
Seattle
yeah.
in the Aquarian age. I used to
Right.
go to the psychedelic ballroom all the time.
Right. That kind of blew my mind when I realized you were into that as well. Because a lot of people I know are like, you know, don't want to have anything to do with that. But what would you say about just kind of the scene today in terms of, do you feel things are more polarized now between black musicians and white musicians than they were back then? Or?
In some ways, it's just as, and it's one of the saddest aspects of it to me is that there's still this huge gap. And, you know, when black people go to a blues show, they don't really care if none of the artists is playing guitar. You know, they want a good singer to tell good stories with a beat they can dance to. White people and they want the artist to have a fur coat and rings on every finger and bling around their neck and all that stuff. White people don't care about any of that. They're happy if the artist is wearing raggedy jeans. You know, they want high energy. They want flashy guitar playing. You know, and I'm probably oversimplifying a little, but still, I think the black and white audience tend to fundamentally hear blues in a different way.
Yeah.
And black people tend to hear it more like they hear soul music and gospel music, and more white people came to it through rock.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know how controversial it is among the younger black artists of whether blues rock has ruined the blues or not. You know?
Yeah. Well, what do you think? Do you think it has?
I I think blues comes in lots of flavors, and I can appreciate why some people don't particularly care for that flavor, but I know lots of people that can't stand jazz blues, which is one of my favorite parts of it too.
True.
So, or country acoustic blues versus electric. You know, the generous way to say it, I think one of the people at Blues Music magazine maybe said blues is a big house with lots of rooms.
Yeah.
But it is still polarized in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm not to pick on Curtis Salgado at all. I know he agrees with this, but you know, he perennially wins the Male Soul Blues Vocalist of the Year award. And you know, he knows himself, if he went on the touring like the Blues Is All Right package, about 10 people in the audience would know who he is.
Yeah. Right.
You know, they're there to hear Sir Charles Jones or you know.
And Curtis has kind of said that, like,
Yeah,
why
well,
am I winning next to
I've
the other
heard
guys that are nominated, William Bell or whoever.
Yeah, I've heard him
else.
give beautiful acceptance speeches saying that. You know, there was one year Willie Walker was a candidate, and that's pretty much exactly what Curtis said. Why am I up here when guys like that?
Well, and it's a good question. Why is it like that?
Yeah, well,
is it just familiarity?
People like music they can relate to. Sam Charters told Larry Hoffman that people like music by people that look like them.
Right.
I remember way back in the late 60s, there was a Rolling Stone interview with Mike Bloomfield, and he was trying to explain that. And he said, let's face it, when a teenage suburban girl is in her bedroom fantasizing about the musicians that she loves, she's thinking about Herman's Hermits, not Albert King or Sam and Dave.
Or Howlin' Wolf.
Yep.
Howlin' Wolf over her
Well, you see the
bed.
pictures of Wolf with these hippie chicks.
Right. Just like little playthings next to him, yeah. Well, yeah, I heard that a long time ago about they related it to Big Bill, that when they can look at Paul McCartney or Big Bill, which are they
Yeah, yeah.
which one are they gonna go to?
Yeah, so this is kind of natural, and
Yeah.
that's what they tend to get fed through the mass media too. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, one of the reasons I stopped listening to B.B. King's blues fills when I want to hear Sweet Little Angel. I'm sorry, but it's not the Robin Trower version. You never hear soul blues on it.
No,
on it.
on XM.
No.
Yeah. That's true, man. Well, it's an odd thing, man. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to think.
But at the same time, I mean, number one, there's obviously a lot of cross fertilization and exposure, more than it used to be. Although there's still a lot of work to be done. You look at the average festival lineup for starters, but there's been some progress, and more people are more aware of the people on traditionally what's been the other side of the fence. But it's still a pretty fundamental divide in the perception of what blues is, I think. I mean, if you ask a black person in Chicago who's the queen of the blues, Denise LaSalle.
Right. And if you asked a white person, what would they say? Susan Tedeschi?
Well, I mean, Coco Taylor is the Chicago answer, but
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other thing.
Well, but that's another perspective for you. I remember when Susan was first starting to create a little buzz, but she hadn't been signed yet.
Right.
And she came and played a gig at Legends, and everybody in the biz was there. And by the time she left town, she was with a powerful booking agency and management. But these people are just all over her. And I could think of so many great black artists who they'd be at Legends and they'd be pretty lonely there. Let's put it that way.
So regarding that, why do you think that was?
Well, it's because look at the numbers. I hate to say it. I mean, okay, I think it was 91 maybe. I had two productions come out. One was Johnny Winter's first Point Blank album, Let Me In, which Albert Castilli and Mike Zito have both raved to me about recently. And that had Illustrated Man on it, and it sold well. And then I did a Johnny Hartzman album for Alligator. Bruce let me fulfill a long-time dream that I'd had since the 77 San Francisco Blues Festival. And I always used to think, man, if I could just take like 5,000 of those sales of the Johnny Winter album and apply them to the Johnny Hartzman album, everybody'd still be dancing the happy dance.
Right.
But the gap was so wide, and Johnny and his band told me the Hartzman album was what they were listening to on the tour bus all summer. But, you got a black jazzy kind of artist who people don't know about, and then you got a white blues rock icon, and, I get it.
Yeah, so it's really just the divide in, the more rock mentality versus a jazzy blues mentality.
I think that's a part of it, and just what are people exposed to, and what can they relate to, as we've been discussing.
Yeah, I know I had a hard time with the jazzy thing when I was a kid, and horns. I used to not like horns.
Oh yeah, well sure. I'm sure we both knew lots of people. I knew one guy that he used to swear, horns have no place on a blues record, and his brother would say, "What about Junior Parker?" Well, that's different.
Did you ever get to see Junior Parker, by the way?
Despite that poster, I never did.
You never did?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I wish I had. I've compiled a reissue for MCA, and I've got all his stuff, but he passed away 1971 or something like that. He had an apartment here. I think he in the same building as
That's what I heard.
C. Campbell's sister.
He lived by Dave Myers. I think.
Yeah, in the 70s.
Right. And the other thing is, I mean, it seems like now blues has almost been split beyond, like into, for example, there's, now you have, almost like, how can I put it? You have, soul blues. You have just soul. You have, folky blues that's really not blues. I mean, it's really kind of almost gone into this thing where it's, the what describes blues a lot of times almost has no.
Yeah, my it's almost like God. It's a personal definition. You know, I mean, honestly, how many people do you know
Right.
who will let somebody else tell them what blues is?
Right,
It's
right.
a very personal definition.
Yeah.
And to some people, you know, a lot of people talk about the word authenticity as,
Right.
you know, in their mind, that's the defining factor in what's real blues or not. But then they define authenticity completely different. You know, well, my feelings make it authentic.
Right.
You know, my
Right.
picking cotton made it authentic. You know, my being raised in the projects made it authentic.
I mean, it's to the point where as somebody like me or a lot of people of my generation that are white that have been playing blues for years and years, we start to doubt ourselves. Mm-hmm. You know,
Well,
we start to go, well, what we're doing, is it even relevant anymore?
Yep. Well, I thought it was interesting. I don't know if you've heard John Tavius Willis's new CD yet. And by the way, I love John Tavius and his
He's
posse. I
awesome.
think that's
Yeah,
one of the
he's
best
awesome.
developments for the blues in recent years. And he's the
I agree.
ringleader. But that whole circle of young
Right.
people who really
Andrew
care about
Ali
the
and,
tradition and the knowledge of Mac McDonald and
McDonald,
Stephen Hall and
Right.
Kingfish and Marquise
Right.
Knox and
Right.
you know, there's just a little coterie, and they, you know, they're very supportive of each other, and they really value the tradition. But there's a song on John Tavius's new CD where he sings, "Some people sing the blues just because they know the song. I sing the blues to pass them along." Mm-hmm. Yeah, that kind of struck me.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's true because I mean, there's that whole thing of what does it take to connect to blues? Mm-hmm. You know?
Well, you know, I think it works best when you don't try to be something you're not.
Right.
Didn't Steve Freund have a song called "Ain't Pick No Cotton" or something
Right.
like that?
Right. Could be. Yeah. Yeah.
He picked with cotton, but but that's different. You know, I think you've got to get people to buy into your story, they've got to kind of believe it. And so you've got to be able to make it something that people, you know, can think it's an honest reflection of you. You know, they don't have to believe it actually happened to you, but at least they should feel like it could have happened to you.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it.
But you know, there's still, it's hotly contested within some aspects of, I know, the Black intellectual arts community, whether the quest for the universal is a good or a bad thing. You know, some think it's displacing Black schools of thought or whatever. But you know, there's that whole thing, and you know, I tend to think that I think blues is securely founded on an African American tradition.
Absolutely.
And always at least should be. But you know, people have to find something in their own story. You know, maybe they lost somebody they care about. You know, maybe they got wiped out by identity theft. I mean, you know, there's a lot of ways to get the blues.
There are
you know,
a lot of ways
flat
to get the
tire in the
blues,
middle of a rainstorm out in the middle of nowhere. You know? So, you know, I just think, you know, instead of burlesquing it, you know, just do something of meaning. And that's what I liked about some of the stuff on your newest one.
Well,
You know,
thank you.
It's your Tales of Woe are relevant.
They are relevant. Yeah. Well, that's one thing about, I mean, in a lot of ways, the way I look at it is kind of when you've been doing the blues as long as I have, you're going to find some stuff in there.
Yep.
You know what I mean? I mean, for reals, you know, it's like, you can't do this. I mean, I love what you just said about the obscurity, the thing of obscurity, and that being significant in somebody's story. Because there is something to be said anytime I get down about this music and playing it, I always go back to those older cats, you know, the Eddie Taylors and Sam Lay and guys that went through so much and got so little financial reward for, you know, the amount of greatness that they put into their music.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, Eddie Taylor and Lowell Fulson are two examples of, you know, true blues immortals who up till the end were playing those same little ghetto joints for the same little ghetto money that they've been playing in the 50s.
Right, exactly. And it's like, I mean, to me, those guys were absolute heavyweights. And at the same time, I remember one time asking Ed Chmielewski about at Blind Pig. I go, how many records did that? The one in Japan that Eddie did. I said, how many did that sell? He goes, oh, that only sold 600 copies worldwide. And I'm just thinking, how can that be?
Yeah, well, maybe 8 years ago or so, I was at the Porretta Soul Festival, and I was talking to one of the people at Ace Records, Tony Rounce, who goes there every year with a suitcase full of pillows, which you need at Porretta because it's a long day on concrete bleachers.
Aye.
But he told me they'd done some figuring at Ace, and when they put out a real mainstream blues reissue CD at that point by like Wynonie Harris or Roy Brown or Cleanhead Vincent or something like that, it was down to less than 1,000 projected sales worldwide. So the worldwide total number of blues freaks who were committed enough to be buying the new stuff was down below 1,000, and that's almost 10 years ago. Yeah, I mean, sales numbers are the less we know about them, the better. It's really
well, I mean, I think a lot of that too is that these guys haven't been around for such a long time.
By the way, when I was producing, I also forgot to mention Blind Pig. They were good. They brought me into do Magic Slim, mostly keep him honest and stop him from re-recording stuff.
Right.
But we did 2 really, really well-received ones, and then I did Big Bill Morganfield for him. But when I was doing Magic Slim, Jill Judas from Blind Pig, we both would readily agree. It was perfectly understood that the only reason that he could afford to keep putting Magic Slim CDs out was Tommy Castro. I mean, I've told Tommy that.
What do you mean because of Tommy Castro?
Because it was the sales from Tommy that allowed them to not sell as many Magic Slim CDs.
Right. I got you. So in other words, he was using that overflow into the other thing. Yeah. Wow.
And I've had a similar discussion with Bruce at different points, when he's conservative about some artist who I know he really likes, but he's just not sure if the return is going to justify. I'll say, Bruce, you've put in all this work for so long. What's the point of it if you can't indulge yourself at least once in a while?
Right. Good point. Yeah. And I mean, I know for somebody like myself, I feel like one of the things that I've always tried to do is to try to bring people out to California to expose them to an audience that they're normally not going to get.
Well, you've done that with a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're known for.
That's kind of what I want to be known for because I feel like that's my purpose, And I think there's a lot of people that have been in this business, that I look up to, like Johnny Otis or Ike Turner or people like that did that their whole careers. They brought people out, to get them recorded.
Here's a quick Ike story related to that. I had a couple of friends at the University of Chicago from Texas, and they had seen Ike and Tina at a county fair down there. And they were driving home afterwards and pulled up at some Greasy Spoon to get a bite on the way home. And the whole entourage was in there eating. So they went over to Ike and the entourage and complimented him on, the show and how much they'd enjoyed it. And one of them was complimenting Ike on his historical importance. And, you did so much for BB and Bobby Bland and Little Milton and all these people, and yet, here you are still kind of grinding it out, doesn't that bother you? And so Ike says, it really doesn't. I look at these people and, they gotten to be famous and well-known and all that, and people ask me that, but I'm fine with it. You want to know why? And my friends are waiting for Ike to say something like, because this is great talent and it deserves to be heard. He pulls out his bagels, because I got more money than all of them.
That's great. Yeah, I remember there was a museum in Memphis. Remember Bob Height's brother had a music museum right across from the Peabody? Mm-hmm. And I went in there and it was like he had nothing on Ike. And I was like, why is there nothing on Ike in this museum? I can't remember what its reasoning. He goes, well, I do have Jackie Brenston up there. I'm thinking, yeah, but that was Ike's song that made that, But he had some weird reason why.
I heard a version of Rocket 88 yesterday in Joliet by brother John Katke.
Now, who's that?
Oh, he's been around here for a long time. Keyboard player, guitar
Oh,
player.
okay.
Played with Buddy, played with Otis.
Yeah, yeah.
Dave Spector.
Yeah, but I mean, it's true that, these guys were like, they were the ones that kind of turned the world on to all these great people. And even they didn't really get credit for it, So it's
Of course,
it's
Ike made it hard.
I didn't exactly, he didn't exactly promo himself all
Made
that
it very
well.
begrudging, let's put it that way.
I like Ike.
Oh,
Remember
geez.
that?
Yeah, I mean, we could do a podcast just full of Ike stories, but it would be so horrible that you wouldn't be able to use any of it.
True enough, man. Well, what do you see as the future for this music? I mean, do you see it like it's ever gonna kind of be something that? I mean, then again, I mean, I was thinking about this. I was at the McDonald's today eating breakfast, and it was like they were playing New Country.
Is that your tribute to Pine Top?
Yes, I was having my breakfast for Pine Top. But they were playing this New Country stuff, and it was just so bad.
Yeah, you don't know. And I think that's part of it, is that it's going to be something that we probably can't fully...
Can't stomach?
Just not recognize yet.
Yeah.
It just sometimes it sneaks out of left field. I mean, yesterday I heard a version of "Give Me Just One Reason," and you get every once in a while there's a single by Tracy Chapman that comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just kind of has to come stealthily. But I mean, I expect it to keep changing. I just hope that it's going to have to stay relevant in some way, and just like the blues that we love was taking in influences from its day. I mean, Little Walter was soaking up Louis Jordan.
Yeah, and then the guys before him, like Dr. Clayton or whatever. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think it's going to be with us in some form. But we've got to allow it to change and grow, and there's going to be influences in it that we don't particularly care about so much. I mean, there's already mechanized rhythm on a lot
right.
of
Drum machines.
and a lot of other computer techniques, copying and pasting. And,
right.
Oh, hey, I'll just play it right for 12 bars, and then that's the song. We'll just loop it, right?
Right.
So hard to know. I'm trying to think. There was something else related. Bob Porter, in his book about soul jazz, his theory is that the next really significant form of Black American roots music, whatever it is, it's going to come from New Orleans. Just because the beats there are so funky and there's so much character to it. And I thought that was kind of an interesting observation. Of course, New Orleans guy has been slammed pretty good by Katrina and the musical diaspora. But, I mean, people thought guitar was going away, and then here comes Stevie Ray Vaughan and kind of breathes new life into it, but he's just one of a kind.
Right.
And I mean, how do you anticipate a person like Hendrix or Little Walter or Thelonious Monk?
Yeah.
There's no way that's part of the blueprint.
No, and it's the other thing that's really interesting to me is if you look at blues history, there was always this thing of vocalists, then it was piano, then it was saxophone, then it was guitar, then it was harmonica. So in other words, it would always change. The instruments would always change.
What I think Hammond Scott's long had an interesting point since the Blacktop Glory years, where people look at rock and roll. Well, what was the major rock and roll instrument? It was saxophone.
Yeah, not really guitar.
Yeah, I mean, and even piano more than guitar.
Right.
I mean, there was Chuck Berry, but for every Chuck Berry, there was a Lee Allen or a Plas Johnson behind the scenes, King Curtis, Maxwell Davis, whoever. And
that's really not there anymore.
Or not nearly as much.
Not in blues,
sure.
anyway. Yeah, in jazz there still is. But it's going to be interesting.
So there'll probably be continuing ebbs and flows. I mean, there seems like there always are, and who knows what is going to happen to the business model. I don't know what's post streaming.
Yeah, I don't either. Yeah, I'm still putting out CDs.
probably a chip in our head with a networking function.
Oh man, just so it's not the wrong one.
Oh, yeah, really.
Just so it's not New Country. Oh, it was hard listening to that today, I'll tell you.
But I mean, like sometimes those fusion things work out okay. I mean, I also used to say in the '70s, Guitar Watson and Bobby Rush, they were the two that found something good to do with disco and the blues.
Right.
You know, everybody, all the other blues artists. I knew disco was over when all the blues artists wanted to record some disco.
Right. They're a day late and $1 short, aren't they?
And you know, I'm sure. I mean, you know, it's been quite a while. Back in the '80s, I remember one of the first blues songs that had a rap instead of an instrumental solo was "Fine Brown Frame" by Syl Johnson.
Oh, right, I got that
Which
record.
Cotton's
yeah.
on that.
Right,
if
I got that
remember
record.
right. Yeah.
I found that here in Chicago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's been going on. And then Denise LaSalle, she had another early one like that. I think it was "Don't Jump My Pony," where, you know, instead of a solo, there's a rap. And, you know, there are occasional attempts, most of which I think just don't work well.
Yeah.
You know, true fusion is a real art, and I don't think it's often really achieved. A lot of times it's pretty painful, and I'll use the Butterfield Band as a result. You know, that it seemed to me that idea of fusion is like, okay, you play an out solo, and then you play a gut bucket solo,
Right.
You know, and then I'll play Jimmy Reed solo. Or
Yeah. Well, so what do you think when you say that? Are you thinking of East West or what do you?
No,
thinking
no.
of?
The afterwards when he had started bringing in the AACM people. Sanborn.
Oh, Sanborn and them,
Dinwiddie
yeah.
and
Right,
Philip
right,
Wilson,
right.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually like that one record, that last one that he did.
In my own dream.
No,
Oh, the later
sometimes
ones.
I just
Oh,
feel
yeah,
like smiling.
yeah.